When their children called them foolish for buying a crumbling mansion with their life savings, they had no idea that hidden in the dusty attic above was a safe containing $198 million in cash, gold, and priceless artifacts that would transform not just their golden years, but an entire community's future. Before we explore this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The October wind whistled through the bare maple trees as Harold and Evelyn Martinez pulled their aging Honda Accord up the winding gravel driveway. The engine made that familiar grinding noise it had been making for the past 6 months. The one their son, Michael, kept insisting meant they needed a new car. But Harold and Evelyn had learned to make things last. 72 years of life had taught Harold that sometimes the things that sound broken just need patience. 69 years had taught Evelyn that the most beautiful treasures often come disguised as problems nobody else wants to solve. Ahead of them loomed Rosewood Manor, a Victorian mansion that had sat abandoned for nearly 30 years. Paint peeled from its grand pillars like old skin. Broken shutters hung at odd angles, some missing entirely, leaving dark windows that stared down at them like hollow eyes. The wraparound porch sagged in places where support beams had given way to time and neglect. Weeds had claimed the once manicured gardens, creating a wild jungle where roses and ivy fought for dominance against oak saplings that had sprouted through cracked walkways. Harold turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment, his weathered hands still gripping the steering wheel. 47 years of construction work had left his fingers permanently stained and scarred, but they were steady hands, capable hands, the kind that had built solid foundations for dozens of families over the decades. Beside him, Evelyn clutched the deed in her trembling fingers. Her gray eyes, still sharp and intelligent despite her age, traced the roofline of their new home, taking in every broken gutter, every missing shingle, every sign of the enormous task they'd just committed to undertaking. "The kids think we've lost our minds," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that rustled through the overgrown hedges. Harold reached over and squeezed her hand, feeling the thin skin and the wedding ring she'd worn for 47 years. "Maybe we have," he said with a slight smile. "But it's our minds to lose." They had shocked their 3 adult children by spending their entire retirement savings, $250,000, accumulated over decades of careful budgeting and modest living, on this forgotten monument to another era. The money represented every sacrifice they'd made, every vacation they'd postponed, every luxury they'd decided they could live without. It was their security, their safety net, their insurance against the uncertainties of aging, and they'd just spent every penny of it on a house that most people would have condemned. Their son, Michael, the accountant, had called them dangerously irresponsible when they announced their decision during Sunday dinner 2 weeks earlier. His exact words, delivered with a kind of controlled frustration that made his jaw tighten and his voice drop to a whisper, had been, "You're 72 and 69 years old. You should be moving into a retirement community, not taking on a renovation project that would challenge someone half your age." Their daughter, Patricia, the lawyer, had been more blunt. She'd suggested they needed mental health evaluations, questioned whether they were experiencing some kind of shared delusion, and offered to contest the sale if they'd been pressured or misled by the real estate agent. She'd even gone so far as to research elder abuse laws, convinced that someone had taken advantage of her parents' supposedly diminished judgment. Their youngest, David, the software engineer who lived in Seattle and prided himself on logical thinking and data-driven decisions, had simply hung up the phone when they told him. He'd called back an hour later to apologize, but his message had been clear. He couldn't support what he saw as financial suicide disguised as an adventure. But Harold and Evelyn saw something their children couldn't. While everyone else looked at Rosewood Manor and saw decay, expense, and an impossible restoration project, they saw possibility. They saw carved mahogany banisters that just needed polish to restore their warm glow. They saw stained glass windows that would scatter rainbows across hardwood floors once the grime was cleaned away. They saw high ceilings that would make every room feel grand and spacious. They saw a wraparound porch where they could drink coffee in the mornings and watch sunsets in the evenings. Most importantly, Johns saw home. The real estate agent, a young woman named Sarah, who couldn't have been older than 30 and who wore a perpetual expression of confusion whenever she interacted with Harold and Evelyn, met them at the mansion's front door. She'd been trying to talk them out of the purchase for weeks, ever since they'd first toured the property and made their offer within 24 hours. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" she asked one final time as she handed Harold the ornate brass keys. The inspection report listed 47 significant issues that need immediate attention. The electrical system needs to be completely rewired. The plumbing hasn't been updated since the 1950s. The roof has multiple leaks. The foundation has settling problems. And that's just the beginning. Sarah had been thorough in her attempts to dissuade them. She'd provided estimates from contractors that ranged from $60,000 to over $100,000 for necessary repairs. She'd connected them with structural engineers who'd warned about potential safety issues. She'd even arranged for them to speak with other couples who'd attempted similar restoration projects, most of whom had exceeded their budgets by hundreds of thousands of dollars before eventually abandoning their efforts. "We've never been more sure of anything," Evelyn replied firmly, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had sustained her through decades of challenges her children knew nothing about. The early years of their marriage, when Harold's construction business barely broke even and they'd survived on peanut butter sandwiches and determination. The year Harold had been injured on a job site and couldn't work for 8 months while his broken back healed. The miscarriages before Patricia was born, the times when medical bills had threatened to bankrupt them, the seasons when Harold's work dried up and they'd wondered how they'd pay rent, let alone save for their children's futures. Harold and Evelyn had learned something their successful, comfortable children had never needed to understand. That security doesn't come from having enough money to avoid all risks. Security comes from knowing you can survive whatever challenges life presents, from trusting your ability to adapt and overcome and rebuild when necessary. As Sarah's silver sedan disappeared down the gravel driveway, kicking up dust that swirled in the afternoon sunlight, the elderly couple stood alone before their massive new responsibility. The mansion stretched 3 stories high, with dozens of windows staring down at them like watchful eyes. Gothic Revival architecture, mixed with Victorian elegance, created an imposing facade that would have intimidated anyone with sense. Ornate cornices decorated every corner. Stone gargoyles perched on ledges, their carved faces weathered but still commanding. A round tower rose from the mansion's east wing, topped with a conical roof that had lost several slates but still maintained its fairy tale silhouette. Harold inserted the ornate brass key into the front door's lock. The key itself was a work of art, heavy and intricate, with decorative scrollwork that suggested it had been crafted by hand rather than machine. It turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been recently maintained despite the mansion's abandoned appearance. The heavy oak door, carved with elaborate panels depicting roses and vines, opened with a long, mournful creak that echoed through the empty halls inside. They stepped across the threshold into the grand foyer, and both of them stopped breathing for a moment. Their footsteps echoed on marble floors that were hidden beneath decades of dust, but still showed hints of the elegant black and white checkerboard pattern underneath. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, its hundreds of pieces dulled by neglect, but still magnificent in its complexity. Every teardrop crystal, every curved arm, every delicate chain spoke of an era when craftsmanship was valued over efficiency, when beauty was considered essential rather than optional. A sweeping staircase curved upward toward the mansion's upper floors, its carved wooden banisters flowing like frozen water up to a landing decorated with a massive stained glass window. Even covered with grime, the window revealed glimpses of deep blues and rich reds that promised spectacular light shows once the glass was properly cleaned. "My goodness," Evelyn breathed, her voice full of wonder rather than fear. She'd spent her entire adult life in modest homes, practical spaces designed for function rather than beauty. But this was something from a different world entirely, a world where people had built homes that were meant to last for generations, where every detail had been considered and crafted with care. They spent the first hour just walking through the main floor, discovering room after room of forgotten grandeur. The parlor contained a marble fireplace, large enough to stand inside, its mantelpiece carved with intricate patterns of leaves and flowers. The wood was darkened with age, but showed no signs of the rot or damage they'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows, though clouded with years of accumulated dirt, still filled the room with soft, filtered light. The formal dining room could have seated 20 people comfortably around the massive table that had been left behind. The table's surface was covered with a thick layer of dust, but underneath Harold could see the warm glow of what appeared to be solid mahogany. A sideboard along one wall displayed the same quality of craftsmanship, with drawers that still slid smoothly despite their age. The kitchen, though outdated by modern standards, was enormous and filled with natural light from tall windows that overlooked what had once been formal gardens. The appliances were from the 1950s, but they appeared to be high-quality pieces that might still function with proper maintenance. More importantly, the kitchen's layout was practical and efficient, designed by someone who understood how food preparation actually worked. But it was when they climbed to the second floor that they began to sense they'd stepped into something more than just an old house. Family portraits lined the hallway walls, faces from another century, staring down with expressions that seemed both welcoming and secretive. The paintings were professional quality, museum pieces that depicted men in formal evening wear and women in elaborate gowns. Each portrait was labeled with brass nameplates: Theodore Ashford, 1865 to 1943, Margaret Ashford, 1872 to 1951, Charles Ashford, 1900 to 1958. The master bedroom contained a four-poster bed that looked like it belonged in a museum, its mahogany frame carved with the same intricate detail they'd seen throughout the house. The bed was made, covered with what had once been fine linens, now yellowed with age, but still intact. Someone had taken care to preserve this room, to maintain it even after the house had been abandoned. At the end of the hallway, they found a library that took their breath away. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled with leather-bound books, stretched from the hardwood floors to the 12-foot ceilings. Rolling ladders on brass tracks provided access to the upper shelves. Harold carefully removed one of the books and opened it, revealing pages that looked as crisp and white as if they'd been printed yesterday. Many appeared to be rare first editions, books that would be valuable in any condition, but had been preserved in near-perfect state. Who were the Ashford family? Evelyn asked, reading the nameplate on an old family portrait that showed 3 generations posed in the mansion's front parlor. Harold shrugged, but he was beginning to understand that the Ashfords hadn't been ordinary wealthy people. Everything in the house spoke of education, culture, and careful stewardship. These weren't people who'd simply bought expensive things to display their wealth. These were people who'd valued quality, beauty, and permanence. People who'd built a home that was meant to last and to mean something. As evening approached and long shadows began stretching across the hardwood floors, they made their way to the 3rd floor. The stairs here were narrower than the grand staircase they'd climbed to reach the 2nd floor, suggesting this level had originally been designed for servants' quarters. But what they found was unexpected. The 3rd floor contained 5 spacious bedrooms, each one beautifully appointed with the same attention to detail they'd seen throughout the rest of the house. These weren't cramped servant quarters. These were comfortable family rooms, suggesting that the Ashfords had been the kind of people who treated their household staff with respect and consideration. But it was at the end of the hallway that Harold noticed something odd. The wallpaper pattern didn't quite match along one section of the wall. Upon closer examination, he could see the faint outline of what appeared to be a doorway that had been covered over with wallpaper that almost, but not quite, matched the rest of the hallway. "That's strange," Harold muttered, running his weathered fingers along the barely visible edges. The seam was so subtle that most people would have missed it entirely, but Harold's construction experience had taught him to notice when things didn't quite fit properly. "Maybe a storage closet?" Evelyn suggested, though something in her voice indicated she didn't quite believe her own suggestion. Harold found his utility knife in his toolbox and carefully cut through the old wallpaper along the seam. Behind it was indeed a door, but not a closet door. This was a full-sized entrance with an antique brass knob that matched the quality of hardware they'd seen throughout the rest of the house. When he turned the knob, the door opened to reveal something completely unexpected, a narrow staircase leading upward into darkness. "There's another floor," Evelyn said, her voice filled with curiosity rather than concern. Harold retrieved the powerful flashlight they'd brought from the car and tested it. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing steep wooden stairs that appeared to be in excellent condition despite their age. "The attic," he said. "I didn't even think about there being another level above this." They climbed the stairs carefully, Harold leading with the flashlight while Evelyn followed close behind, one hand on his shoulder for stability and reassurance. The stairs were steep but solid, built with the same attention to quality they'd found everywhere else in the mansion. At the top, they emerged into a vast attic space that stretched across what appeared to be the entire mansion. The ceiling was high, enough that they could stand upright comfortably, and moonlight filtered through several small windows, creating patterns of silver and shadow on the dusty wooden floor. But this wasn't the chaotic mess of forgotten belongings that most people would expect to find in an abandoned house's attic. Everything was carefully organized, systematically arranged, as if someone had been using this space regularly until very recently. Furniture was covered with sheets that looked clean despite the mansion's years of abandonment. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls, each one labeled in careful handwriting. Trunks were arranged in rows, their brass hardware polished, and their leather straps still supple. "Look at this," Evelyn called softly from across the room. She discovered a collection of family photographs arranged on an antique table, as if someone had been looking through them recently. The photographs showed the Ashford family through several decades, elegant parties in the mansion's gardens, children playing on the wraparound porch, family gatherings in the dining room they'd seen earlier. Harold was examining something else entirely. Near the center of the attic space, he'd found what appeared to be a small office or study area. A desk sat beneath one of the windows, its surface covered with papers that looked far too recent to have been sitting in an abandoned attic for 3 decades. Maps of the local area were spread across the desk, some of them marked with notes in what appeared to be recent ink. "Evelyn," Harold called, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "Come, look at this." She approached the desk and immediately understood her husband's concern. The papers weren't yellowed with age, the ink wasn't faded. Someone had been using this space recently, very recently. Harold picked up one of the maps and studied it carefully. It showed the mansion and the surrounding property, with several areas marked in red ink. Notes in the margins indicated dates from just a few months earlier. One notation read, "Final preparations complete, awaiting transfer to worthy successors." "Worthy successors?" Evelyn read over his shoulder. "What does that mean?" Before Harold could respond, they heard a sound that made them both freeze. Footsteps on the wooden stairs they'd just climbed. Slow, deliberate footsteps that suggested someone else was in the mansion with them. Harold turned off his flashlight immediately, plunging them into the silver-gray dimness of moonlight, filtering through dirty windows. They stood perfectly still, listening to the footsteps grow closer. Whoever was climbing those stairs wasn't trying to be stealthy. They were walking with the confidence of someone who belonged here, someone who had every right to be in this supposedly abandoned mansion. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a man, elderly but moving with surprising grace, wearing a long coat and carrying what appeared to be an old-fashioned lantern. When he spoke, his voice was cultured, educated, with the kind of accent that suggested generations of good breeding. "Don't be afraid," the man said gently. "I've been expecting you." Harold found his voice first. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The stranger smiled, an expression that seemed genuinely warm, despite the strange circumstances. "My name is Edmund Ashford. I'm the last caretaker of this estate, and I've been waiting a very long time for the right people to arrive." He set his lantern on a nearby table, filling the attic with warm, golden light that was somehow more comforting than Harold's harsh flashlight had been. In the lantern's glow, they could see that Edmund appeared to be in his 80s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His clothes were old-fashioned but impeccably maintained, suggesting someone who valued quality and tradition above current fashion. "I know you have questions," Edmund continued, "and I promise to answer them all. But first, let me show you why this house chose you, and why you chose it." He walked toward the far corner of the attic, where Harold and Evelyn now noticed another covered shape that they hadn't examined yet. Edmund carefully removed the sheet, revealing something that made both of them step back in amazement. It was a large, old-fashioned safe, the kind banks used in the early part of the 20th century. But this safe wasn't just sitting in the corner like an abandoned piece of furniture. It was built into the wall itself, surrounded by wooden panels that made it appear to be a permanent part of the mansion's architecture. "The Ashford family has been waiting for you for nearly 50 years, Edmund said, approaching the safe with something approaching reverence. "Not you specifically, of course, but people like you. People with the character and wisdom to appreciate what they've been entrusted with." Harold and Evelyn exchanged glances, both of them feeling as though they'd stepped into a dream, or perhaps a story from a book. None of this seemed quite real: the hidden attic room, the mysterious caretaker, the built-in safe that looked like it belonged in a museum. Edmund noticed their confusion and smiled again. "I know this is overwhelming. When your real estate agent listed this property, she had no idea what she was actually selling. She knew only that it was an old house that had been maintained by a trust fund for decades. What she didn't know was that the trust fund was established specifically to keep this house preserved until the right buyers came along." "Right buyers?" Evelyn managed to ask. "The Ashford family believed that wealth carried responsibilities," Edmund explained, running his hand along the safe's ornate brass fittings. "They believed that true prosperity should be shared with worthy people who would use it wisely. So they created a system to ensure their legacy would eventually pass to people who demonstrated the character they valued." Harold's practical nature asserted itself despite the strangeness of the situation. "What kind of system?" Edmund turned to face them directly. "They arranged for this house to be sold only to people of modest means, people who showed the courage to take on a challenge that others would avoid. People who looked at a broken-down mansion and saw potential rather than problems. People who were willing to commit their resources to something they believed in, even when their own families thought they were making a mistake." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Harold and Evelyn looked at each other, beginning to understand that their impulse purchase of an abandoned mansion might have been something else entirely. "The safe," Evelyn whispered. "What's in the safe?" Edmund's smile deepened. "The answer to every financial worry you've ever had. The solution to every dream you've ever postponed because you couldn't afford to pursue it. The means to help not just yourselves, but your entire community." He approached the safe and began turning the combination dial with practiced ease, as if he'd performed this action many times before. "But more than that," he continued as the tumblers clicked into place, "it contains proof that ordinary people, given extraordinary opportunities, can accomplish remarkable things." The safe door swung open with barely a whisper, revealing darkness within. Edmund lifted his lantern and held it close to the opening, and the warm light revealed something that made Harold and Evelyn gasp simultaneously. Stacks of currency, neatly bundled, and carefully preserved. Gold bars gleaming in the lantern light. Wooden boxes that could only contain jewelry or precious stones. Documents tied with ribbons. What appeared to be rolled artwork or maps. And filling every available inch of space, treasure that seemed to go on forever, deeper into the safe than should have been physically possible. $198 million, Edmund said quietly, accumulated over 4 generations of careful investment and preserved for nearly half a century, waiting for people who would understand what to do with it. Harold felt his knees weaken and reached out to steady himself against the nearest wall. Evelyn sank into a nearby chair that Edmund had apparently positioned there for exactly this purpose. Neither of them could speak for several minutes. Finally, Harold found his voice. "This can't be real. People don't just find treasure in houses they buy for retirement." Edmund nodded understandingly. "Under normal circumstances, you'd be absolutely right. But the Ashford family wasn't normal. They were visionaries who believed that the greatest wealth comes from giving other people the opportunity to prove themselves." He gestured toward the safe and its impossible contents. Theodore Ashford, the family patriarch, made his fortune in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but he was also a student of history, and he understood that great fortunes often disappear within a few generations unless they're managed by people who truly understand their value. Edmund walked to the desk where Harold had found the recent maps and picked up a leather-bound journal. Theodore's plan was simple but brilliant. Rather than leave his wealth to biological heirs who might squander it, he arranged for it to be given to people who demonstrated the character traits he valued most: courage, determination, practical wisdom, and genuine care for community. "But how did they know we would?" Evelyn began, then stopped, realizing her question didn't make complete sense. "How did they know you would be the right people?" Edmund finished for her. "They didn't know specifically. But they created conditions that would attract the right kind of people while discouraging the wrong kind. The house was priced low, enough that only people of modest means could afford it, but high enough that buyers would have to commit significant resources. The condition of the mansion ensured that only people willing to work hard would be interested, and the lack of obvious treasure meant that treasure hunters and get-rich-quick schemers would look elsewhere. Harold was beginning to understand. They were looking for people who would buy the house because they loved it, not because they thought it would make them rich. "Exactly," Edmund confirmed. "People who would see potential where others saw problems. People who would commit their resources to something they believed in, even when the smart, safe choice would be to walk away." He opened the leather journal and showed them a page filled with careful handwriting. Theodore wrote detailed descriptions of the kind of people he hoped would eventually inherit his legacy. Reading his words, "I believe he could have been describing you specifically." Evelyn leaned forward to read the faded ink. "I hope these resources will find their way to people who understand that true security comes not from hoarding wealth, but from using it wisely. People who have worked hard for everything they've achieved, who value family and community above personal gain, and who possess the courage to take calculated risks in pursuit of worthy goals." The description was so accurate, it made both of them shiver. Harold had spent his entire career taking calculated risks, bidding on construction projects that stretched his resources but offered the opportunity to build something meaningful. Evelyn had supported every decision, even when it meant sacrificing immediate comfort for long-term security. "There's more," Edmund said, turning to another page. Theodore specifically wanted his fortune to go to people who had been dismissed or underestimated by others, people whose families and friends might consider them foolish for following their instincts rather than conventional wisdom. Harold and Evelyn looked at each other, thinking about their children's reactions to the mansion purchase. Michael's accusations of financial irresponsibility, Patricia's suggestions that they needed mental health evaluations, David's angry phone call and abrupt hang-up. "We fit the profile," Harold said wonderingly. Edmund nodded. "Perfectly. Which is why I've been maintaining this house for the past 5 years, waiting for you to find it." The real estate listing was carefully crafted to attract exactly the right kind of buyers. The price was set to ensure affordability for working-class families, but not so low as to suggest something was wrong. And the timing was arranged to coincide with the moment when the right people would be looking for exactly this kind of opportunity. "You mean our retirement?" Evelyn realized. People at your stage of life, with your background and values, who were looking for one final adventure, one last chance to build something meaningful, Edmund confirmed. People who had worked their entire lives but had never been given the opportunity to dream truly big dreams. The enormity of what they'd stumbled into was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about finding treasure. This was about being chosen, being trusted, being deemed worthy of a responsibility that could change not just their lives, but potentially the lives of everyone around them. "What happens now?" Harold asked. Edmund smiled, and for the first time since they'd met him, he looked truly relaxed. "Now you begin the most important phase of your lives. Now you discover what it means to have the resources to make every dream a reality. But more than that, you discover what it means to carry on a legacy of wisdom, generosity, and service that has been waiting 50 years for the right people to embrace it." He gestured toward the safe and its incredible contents. "This treasure doesn't belong to you. You are its guardians, its stewards. Your job is to determine how it can best serve not just your family, but your entire community." As Harold and Evelyn sat in that candlelit attic, surrounded by more wealth than they'd ever imagined, they began to understand that their purchase of an abandoned mansion had been something far more significant than a retirement adventure. They had been chosen to carry forward a legacy that would test every value they'd ever held, every principle they'd ever embraced, and their real adventure was just beginning. The lantern light flickered across the safe's contents like golden water, illuminating wealth beyond comprehension. Harold stepped closer, his weathered hands trembling as he reached toward the stacks of currency that filled the safe's interior. Each bundle was wrapped with paper bands that bore official markings, and the bills themselves looked crisp and new, despite their obvious age. Hundreds, thousands, bills he'd never seen before, in denominations that seemed almost fictional. "Go ahead," Edmund encouraged gently. "Touch them. They're real." Harold picked up one of the bundles with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred. The paper felt authentic beneath his fingers, and when he fanned through the bills, he could see they were genuine currency from different eras, some dating back to the 1920s, others more recent. Each bundle contained exactly 100 bills, and there were dozens of bundles stacked in neat rows. Evelyn moved to examine the gold bars, which gleamed like captured sunlight in the lantern's glow. Each bar was roughly the size of a paperback book but far heavier, stamped with official markings that read United States Treasury and 999.9 fine gold. She tried to lift one and nearly dropped it, surprised by the weight. 12.5 kilograms each, Edmund explained. At today's gold prices, each bar is worth approximately $500,000. Harold counted quickly. There were at least 20 gold bars visible, which meant $10 million in gold alone. But that was just one section of the safe. Wooden boxes lined other shelves, each one carefully labeled with contents like rare coins, American eagles, European currency, pre-war, and precious stones, certified. "Open one," Edmund suggested, gesturing toward the wooden boxes. Evelyn chose a box labeled family jewelry, investment grade, and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in compartments lined with black velvet, were pieces that belonged in a museum. A diamond necklace that caught the lantern light and threw rainbows across the attic walls. Ruby earrings the size of grapes. An emerald bracelet that looked like it had once adorned royalty. Each piece was accompanied by a small card bearing an official appraisal and authentication certificate. The emerald bracelet alone was appraised at $2.8 million. Edmund noted casually, as if discussing the weather, that it was in 1985. Today's value would be considerably higher. Harold felt his knees buckle and reached out to steady himself against the safe. The numbers were beyond his comprehension. He'd worked construction for 47 years, earned every dollar through honest labor, and had never in his wildest imagination conceived of wealth on this scale. "I don't understand," he said weakly. "How is this possible? People don't just leave treasure worth hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in attics for 50 years. Edmund smiled with the patience of someone who'd anticipated this exact reaction. The Ashford family wasn't like most people. They understood something that modern society has forgotten, that true wealth isn't about accumulation, it's about stewardship. He moved to a section of the safe that contained rolled documents and carefully removed one of the tubes. Theodore Ashford spent 40 years building this collection, but he never considered it his personal fortune. He saw himself as a temporary guardian, preparing these resources for the moment when they could serve their highest purpose. Edmund unrolled what appeared to be an original oil painting, revealing a landscape that looked hauntingly familiar. It was the view from the mansion's front porch, painted with the skill and attention to detail that marked it as the work of a master artist. "This is a Frederick Church," Edmund said reverently. "One of America's greatest landscape painters. Theodore commissioned it specifically because he wanted future inheritors to understand the connection between the treasure and this place. The painting is worth approximately $15 million. Evelyn sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were witnessing. "But why us? Why would anyone trust complete strangers with something like this?" Edmund carefully rolled the painting back into its protective tube before answering. "Because you're not complete strangers." Theodore studied human nature for decades, and he understood that character reveals itself through actions, not words. Every decision you made in purchasing this house demonstrated exactly the qualities he was looking for. He walked to the desk where Harold had first noticed the recent maps and opened a thick leather journal. Theodore kept detailed records of his plan, including specific criteria for identifying worthy inheritors. "Let me read you some of his notes." Edmund adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and began reading in Theodore's elegant handwriting. "The ideal guardians of this legacy will be people who have demonstrated fiscal responsibility through modest means rather than inherited wealth. They will show courage in pursuing opportunities that others consider too risky or impractical. Most importantly, they will have faced dismissal or ridicule from family members who consider practical wisdom less valuable than conventional success." Harold and Evelyn exchanged glances, remembering their children's harsh reactions to the mansion purchase, Michael's accusations of financial irresponsibility, Patricia's suggestions about mental health evaluations, David's angry phone call. Every criticism had unknowingly confirmed their suitability for Theodore's legacy. "There's more," Edmund continued. Theodore wrote, "I seek people who see potential where others see problems, who choose challenging restoration projects over easy comfort, and who demonstrate love for beauty and craftsmanship despite limited resources. These people will understand that this treasure is not a prize to be won, but a responsibility to be embraced." The description fit Harold and Evelyn so perfectly it seemed impossible. They had indeed chosen the challenging restoration project. They had seen potential where everyone else saw problems. And they had committed their life savings to something their own children considered foolish. "How did he know people like us would eventually find this place?" Harold asked. Edmund smiled mysteriously. Theodore didn't leave this discovery to chance. The real estate listing was carefully crafted to attract exactly the right kind of buyers. The price was set to ensure affordability for working-class families while discouraging investors who might flip the property for quick profit. The mansion's condition ensured that only serious renovators would be interested, and the timing was planned to coincide with moments when the right people would be looking for exactly this kind of opportunity. "You mean retirement," Evelyn realized. "People at your stage of life, with your background and values, who were looking for one final adventure," Edmund confirmed. Theodore understood that young families would be overwhelmed by a project this size, and wealthy investors would either demolish the mansion or turn it into something commercial. But retired couples with construction experience and romantic sensibilities, they would see exactly what he hoped they'd see. Edmund moved to another section of the safe and withdrew a manila envelope thick with documents. These are the legal papers that transfer ownership of everything to whoever purchases the mansion and demonstrates the character qualities Theodore specified. The transfer has been approved by courts in 3 states and cleared by federal authorities. Everything you see here becomes legally yours the moment you accept the responsibility that comes with it. Harold stared at the documents, his practical mind struggling to process the legal implications. What kind of responsibility? The same responsibility Theodore carried, Edmund explained. To use this wealth wisely, to support your community, and to ensure that these resources serve the greater good rather than personal indulgence. He opened the journal to another page. Theodore wrote specific guidelines for how the treasure should be used. No more than 20% for personal comfort and security. The remaining 80% should be dedicated to community improvement, education, supporting worthy families, and preserving beauty and craftsmanship for future generations. Evelyn felt tears welling in her eyes. He wanted us to give most of it away? He wanted you to invest it in the world around you, Edmund corrected. Theodore believed that money sitting idle in banks serves no one. Money used to help families, improve communities, and support worthy causes creates value that multiplies across generations. Edmund walked to a wall lined with filing cabinets and opened one of the drawers. Inside were hundreds of folders, each one meticulously labeled and organized. Theodore documented every investment, every acquisition, every decision he made in building this collection. But more than that, he researched and planned dozens of ways the treasure could be used to benefit communities like this one. He pulled out a folder labeled Educational Initiatives and opened it to reveal detailed plans for scholarship programs, community colleges, and vocational training centers. Another folder contained blueprints for public gardens, community centers, and affordable housing projects. A third held business plans for supporting local entrepreneurs and small family businesses. Theodore spent the last 20 years of his life planning how this wealth could best serve communities that had been forgotten by government programs and neglected by major charitable foundations, Edmund explained. He understood that small towns like this one often have the greatest need but the least access to resources. Harold was beginning to understand the true magnitude of what they'd inherited. This wasn't just money, it was a complete philanthropic infrastructure, planned and prepared by someone who dedicated decades to understanding how wealth could create lasting positive change. But why hide it all in a secret safe? Evelyn asked. Why not establish a foundation or work with existing charities? Edmund's expression grew serious. Because Theodore understood that large institutions, however well-intentioned, often become bureaucratic and inefficient. He believed that real change happens when resources are placed in the hands of people who live in the communities they're trying to help. People who understand local needs because they've experienced them personally. He gestured toward Harold and Evelyn. People like you, who've worked hard for everything you've achieved, who understand the difference between needs and wants, and who have the practical wisdom to distinguish between worthy causes and appealing promises. As the implications of their discovery continued to sink in, Harold found himself thinking about their children's reactions. Michael, Patricia, and David had all assumed their parents were making an irresponsible decision based on sentiment and nostalgia. None of them had considered that Harold and Evelyn might possess wisdom that couldn't be measured in traditional terms. Our kids are going to think we've lost our minds completely, Harold said. Edmund chuckled. Theodore anticipated that reaction as well. He wrote, "The inheritors of this legacy will likely face skepticism and criticism from family members who equate success with conventional achievement. This criticism will serve as additional confirmation of their suitability, as it proves they're willing to follow their instincts rather than seeking approval from others. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Edmund continued pulling documents from the filing cabinets, each folder revealing another aspect of Theodore's comprehensive planning. There were detailed assessments of the local community's needs, compiled through decades of careful research, maps showing properties that could be developed for affordable housing, studies of the regional economy and opportunities for sustainable job creation, even architectural plans for renovating abandoned buildings into community resources. Theodore didn't just leave you money, Edmund explained. He left you a complete blueprint for community transformation, developed through 40 years of studying what actually works versus what sounds good in theory. One folder contained photographs and interviews with families Theodore had helped during his lifetime, along with detailed records of which approaches had produced lasting positive results. Another held correspondence with educators, social workers, and community leaders from across the region, documenting their insights about effective ways to address poverty, unemployment, and social isolation. He tested his theories, Evelyn realized, studying the meticulously organized research. He didn't just plan to help people, he actually helped people and learned from the experience. Exactly. Edmund confirmed. Theodore believed that good intentions without practical knowledge often create more problems than they solve, so he spent decades learning how to help effectively, how to support people without creating dependency, and how to strengthen communities without disrupting their existing social structures. Harold examined a folder labeled Failed Experiments that contained honest assessments of Theodore's mistakes, miscalculations, projects that had seemed promising but hadn't worked as intended, approaches that had created unintended consequences, lessons learned through trial and error that would help future philanthropists avoid repeating the same mistakes. He even documented his failures, Harold said with growing admiration. Most people try to hide their mistakes. Theodore understood that failure is part of learning, Edmund replied. He wanted you to have the benefit of his experience, both positive and negative. As they continued examining the safe's contents, they discovered that Theodore's collection wasn't randomly assembled. Every item had been chosen for specific reasons related to his philanthropic vision. The gold provided stable value that could protect the treasure against inflation and economic instability. The rare coins could be sold individually to fund smaller projects without liquidating larger assets. The artwork could be loaned to museums, generating both income and cultural enrichment for communities. Even the jewelry served multiple purposes. Pieces could be sold for major initiatives or loaned for special exhibitions that would attract tourists and cultural attention to small communities. Everything was planned, Evelyn marveled. Every choice, every acquisition, every decision was made with future community service in mind. Edmund nodded. Theodore viewed himself as a steward, not an owner. He assembled this collection not for personal enjoyment, but as a tool for social improvement. They found detailed records showing how Theodore had tested his theories during his lifetime. He'd quietly funded scholarship programs and measured their long-term impact on families and communities. He'd supported small businesses and tracked which types of assistance actually helped entrepreneurs succeed. He'd invested in affordable housing projects and studied which designs created stable, sustainable neighborhoods. Look at this, Harold said, opening a folder labeled Community Garden Initiative. Inside were photographs, financial records, and detailed outcome assessments for 17 community garden projects Theodore had funded across the region. The documentation showed which gardens had thrived, which had failed, and most importantly, why. Gardens located near schools had 93% success rates, Harold read from Theodore's notes. Gardens that included senior citizen participation showed greater long-term sustainability than those focused solely on young families. Gardens that emphasized food production over ornamental plants generated more community engagement, and reduced local food costs by an average of 28% per participating family. Evelyn was examining a similar folder focused on small business support. Theodore tracked every business loan he made for over 30 years, she said wonderingly. He documented which types of businesses succeeded, which types of support were most helpful, and which entrepreneurs were most likely to create jobs for other community members. The research was remarkably sophisticated. Theodore had essentially conducted a private, multi-decade study of effective philanthropy, testing theories and measuring results with the rigor of an academic researcher. But unlike academic studies, his research was entirely practical, focused on approaches that could be implemented by ordinary people with limited resources. "This is better than anything we learned in business school," Harold said, studying Theodore's methodology. He actually measured what worked, instead of just assuming good intentions would lead to good results. Edmund smiled proudly. Theodore was largely self-educated, but he understood the importance of evidence-based decision-making. He believed that helping people effectively required the same careful planning and attention to detail that successful businesses use. As the night wore on, Harold and Evelyn discovered that Theodore had thought of everything. He'd researched tax implications and established legal structures that would minimize the burden on inheritors. He'd identified attorneys, accountants, and other professionals who specialized in philanthropic work and shared his values. He'd even prepared detailed instructions for managing the practical challenges of sudden wealth, including security concerns, family dynamics, and media attention. He anticipated that inheritors would need guidance, Edmund explained, showing them a folder labeled Transition Support. Sudden wealth can be overwhelming and destructive if not handled carefully. Theodore wanted to ensure that the people he chose to receive his legacy would be equipped to manage it responsibly. The folder contained step-by-step guidance for everything from hiring security services to establishing family trusts to managing requests from charities and individuals seeking assistance. Theodore had even prepared template letters for declining funding requests, tactfully, and information about how to evaluate the credibility of organizations seeking support. He protected us from problems we don't even know we're going to face yet, Evelyn realized. Theodore understood that wealth brings challenges as well as opportunities, Edmund confirmed. He wanted to ensure that his inheritors could focus on doing good rather than struggling with the complications of managing extraordinary resources. Perhaps most remarkably, they discovered that Theodore had established ongoing support systems for inheritors. A network of trusted advisors, including estate attorneys, certified financial planners, and philanthropy consultants, all of whom had been briefed on Theodore's vision and were committed to helping inheritors succeed. A quarterly newsletter that had been published for 40 years, sharing updates on effective philanthropy approaches and connecting like-minded donors. Even a small foundation that could provide guidance and assistance to inheritors who needed help implementing Theodore's recommendations. "You're not alone in this," Edmund assured them. Theodore built a community of people dedicated to ensuring his legacy would be used wisely. Harold and Evelyn sat quietly in the lantern light, surrounded by more wealth than they'd ever imagined and more responsibility than they'd ever contemplated. The safe contained not just treasure, but an entire philosophy of service, a comprehensive approach to community improvement, and the tools necessary to implement Theodore's vision effectively. "What happens if we decide we're not ready for this?" Evelyn asked quietly. Edmund considered the question seriously. Theodore anticipated that possibility as well. The legal documents include provisions for transferring the responsibility to other qualified individuals if the initial inheritors feel overwhelmed or unsuited to the task. "There's no shame in recognizing your limitations." But, he continued with gentle conviction, Theodore was remarkably accurate in his assessments of human character. In 40 years of planning, he never chose the wrong people. His system for identifying worthy inheritors was refined through decades of observation and testing. If you're sitting in this room tonight, it's because you possess exactly the qualities necessary to handle this responsibility." Harold looked at his wife of 47 years, seeing in her eyes the same mixture of wonder, fear, and determination he felt in his own heart. They'd always faced challenges together. From the early struggles of building Harold's construction business, to the difficulties of raising 3 strong-willed children, to the uncertainties of retirement, planning on a limited budget. They'd never had wealth, but they'd always had each other, and a shared commitment to doing right by their community. "We accept," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would change not just their lives, but potentially the lives of countless others. Edmund's smile was radiant. "Theodore would be proud, and I believe your real adventure is just beginning." As dawn approached, they carefully secured the safe and began planning their next steps. They had inherited not just treasure, but a mission, and Harold and Evelyn Martinez, the elderly couple their children, had considered foolish for buying an abandoned mansion. Were about to discover what it truly meant to have the resources to make every dream a reality. But first, they would have to tell their children that everything had changed, and that the parents they thought they knew had become something entirely different overnight. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mansion's restored front porch as Harold and Evelyn sat in their old Honda Accord, staring at Harold's cell phone. They'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, neither of them able to work up the courage to make the call that would change everything. Inside the mansion, Edmund was carefully cataloging the safe's contents with the methodical precision of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for decades. Outside, Harold and Evelyn faced a challenge that no amount of treasure could solve, telling their children that everything they thought they knew about their parents was wrong. "Maybe we should start with Patricia," Evelyn suggested quietly. "She's a lawyer. She'll understand the legal implications better than Michael or David." Harold shook his head. "Patricia will think we're being scammed. She'll drive up here with a team of investigators and try to have us declared mentally incompetent before we can explain what really happened." "David then?" "David hung up on us when we bought the house. When we tell him we found $200 million in the attic, he'll probably call the police and report that someone's taken advantage of his elderly parents." Evelyn sighed, understanding her husband's reluctance. Their children had made it clear that they considered the mansion purchase evidence of declining judgment. Telling them about finding a treasure that made them among the wealthiest people in the state would sound like the delusion of people who'd completely lost touch with reality. "Michael," Harold decided finally, "he's an accountant. He understands money. If we can convince him it's real, he can help us convince others." Harold dialed Michael's Chicago office number, knowing his son would be at work by 8:30 on a Tuesday morning. Michael answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone managing multiple clients and constant deadlines. "Dad, is everything okay? You never call during business hours." Harold took a deep breath. "Michael, I need you to sit down." "Dad, I'm in the middle of preparing tax returns. If this is about the house again, I really don't have time to. We found something in the house, son, something that changes everything." There was a pause. Harold could hear the sound of papers being shuffled, as if Michael was trying to multitask while listening to what he assumed would be another conversation about his parents' impractical renovation project. "What kind of something?" "Money, Michael, a lot of money, hidden in a safe in the attic." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, old houses sometimes have cash hidden in walls or floorboards. People used to distrust banks. But we're probably talking about a few $100s. Maybe a few thousand at most." Harold looked at Evelyn, who nodded encouragingly. $198 million, son." The silence that followed was so complete that Harold wondered if the call had been dropped. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, did you just say 198 million? Million. Gold bars, cash, jewelry, artwork, rare coins, all of it authenticated and documented. All of it legal." Harold could hear a chair creaking, as if Michael had indeed sat down heavily. "Dad, this isn't funny. If someone's trying to scam you, No scam, son. We've got a man here who's been maintaining the house for decades, waiting for the right people to find what the original owner left behind. His name is Edmund Ashford, and he's got documentation going back 50 years. Documentation of what? Of a plan. The original owner, Theodore Ashford, set this whole thing up deliberately. He wanted his fortune to go to people who would use it to help their community. He created a system to make sure the right kind of people would find it. Another long silence. Then Michael's voice, strained and careful. Dad, I'm going to hang up now and drive there immediately. Don't sign anything, don't give anyone any money, and don't make any decisions until I arrive. This sounds like the most sophisticated con game I've ever heard of. Michael, wait, but the line was already dead. Harold looked at his wife and shrugged. That went about as well as I expected. Within an hour, all three of their children were either driving toward the mansion or making frantic phone calls to each other. Patricia had cancelled her afternoon court appearances and was speeding up the highway in her BMW, her legal mind already formulating strategies for protecting her parents from what she assumed was an elaborate fraud. David had booked the first available flight from Seattle, convinced that his parents had become victims of criminals who specialized in targeting elderly people. And Michael was calling every contact he had in law enforcement, banking, and fraud investigation, preparing to mount a coordinated response to what he believed was a sophisticated scam operation. By early afternoon, the mansion's gravel driveway looked like a parking lot for a family emergency. Michael's rental car sat beside Patricia's BMW, which was parked next to David's hastily rented SUV. All three siblings had arrived within minutes of each other, and all three were standing on the mansion's front porch with expressions that ranged from grim determination to barely controlled panic. Harold and Evelyn met them at the front door, trying to project calm confidence despite their own uncertainty about how to handle the situation. Behind them, Edmund waited in the foyer with the patient dignity of someone who'd anticipated exactly this scenario. "Mom, Dad," Patricia said immediately, taking charge with the authoritative tone she used in courtrooms, "we need to talk privately before you interact with this man any further." Michael's contacted the FBI, and David's researched confidence schemes that target seniors. "We're here to help you, but you need to trust us and not make any commitments until we've had time to investigate." Harold held up his hand. "Patricia, honey, I understand your concern, but you need to see what we've seen before you make any judgments." "Dad," Michael interjected, "whatever this man has shown you can be faked. Documents, certificates, even cash and jewelry can be sophisticated props designed to make a scam look legitimate. The fact that he's created such an elaborate presentation actually proves this is a con game." David, who'd been quiet until now, stepped forward. "The three of us have researched this Edmund Ashford character. There's no record of him in any database we can find. No social security number, no address, no employment history. He doesn't exist, which means this whole thing is a setup." Edmund, who'd been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Your parents' concern for your welfare is entirely appropriate," he said with gentle dignity, "but your conclusions are based on incomplete information. Perhaps you'd like to examine the evidence before deciding it's fraudulent." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "We're not examining anything until you provide proper identification, business credentials, and legal documentation that can be verified by independent authorities." "Of course," Edmund replied calmly. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio, which he handed to Patricia. "Birth certificate, social security card, driver's license, and a letter of credit from Ashford Family Trust, which has been maintaining this property for 47 years. Patricia examined the documents with the thorough attention she brought to any legal matter. Her expression gradually shifted from suspicion to confusion. "These appear to be authentic," she admitted reluctantly. "But that doesn't explain why there's no digital record of you in modern databases." Edmund smiled. "I've lived a deliberately private life, Miss Martinez. The Ashford family valued discretion, and I've maintained their traditions. But I assure you, I'm quite real, as is the legacy I've been entrusted to protect. Michael stepped forward. Even if you're legitimate, that doesn't mean this treasure story is real. People can create elaborate hoaxes without being criminals themselves. Maybe you genuinely believe what you're saying, but that doesn't make it true. Then perhaps, Edmund suggested, you'd like to see the safe for yourselves. The next hour transformed everything. Harold and Evelyn led their 3 children up the hidden staircase to the secret attic room, where Edmund once again opened the massive safe. The lantern light revealed the same impossible wealth that had overwhelmed Harold and Evelyn the night before. Stacks of currency, gleaming gold bars, jewelry that belonged in museums, and artwork by master painters. Michael, the accountant who'd spent his career dealing with financial documents, was the first to accept that what they were seeing was genuine. He examined the currency bundles, tested the weight of the gold bars, and reviewed the authentication certificates with growing amazement. "This is real," he said quietly, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. "I don't understand how or why, but these assets are authentic." Patricia, trained to evaluate evidence and identify fraud, reached the same conclusion through careful examination of the legal documents Edmund provided. The transfer papers were legitimate, prepared by reputable law firms, and filed with appropriate courts. The treasure had a clear chain of custody dating back to the 1920s. David, the software engineer who approached problems through logical analysis, found Edmund's explanation internally consistent and supported by verifiable facts. The dates matched, the documentation was thorough, and the system Theodore had created was both sophisticated and carefully planned. But accepting that the treasure was real only led to new questions and concerns. As the magnitude of their parents' discovery sank in, all 3 children began to understand the enormous complications that sudden extreme wealth would bring to their family. "Mom, Dad," Patricia said seriously, "do you understand what this means? You're now among the wealthiest people in the state. You'll have tax obligations, security concerns, legal responsibilities. People will treat you differently. Your entire lives will change overnight." Michael nodded grimly. "The IRS will want to know about this immediately. Gift taxes, estate taxes, income taxes on any appreciation. We're talking about tax obligations that could reach into the tens of millions." David, ever practical, focused on security issues. "You can't stay in this house without professional protection. Once word gets out about this discovery, you'll become targets for everyone, from con artists to kidnappers. You'll need bodyguards, security systems, probably new identities." Harold and Evelyn listened to their children's concerns, understanding for the first time how dramatically their quiet retirement had just been disrupted. They'd been so focused on the wonder of the discovery and the responsibility of Theodore's legacy that they hadn't fully considered the practical challenges of managing extraordinary wealth. "Edmund anticipated these concerns," Evelyn said quietly. "He's prepared guidance for handling all of these issues." Edmund nodded and retrieved another folder from his collection of documents. Theodore understood that sudden wealth creates challenges as well as opportunities. He prepared comprehensive instructions for managing the transition safely and legally. The W.U. folder contained contact information for attorneys who specialized in sudden wealth management, accountants who understood large estate taxation, and security firms that provided discreet protection for high net worth individuals. More importantly, it contained step-by-step guidance for maintaining privacy, managing family dynamics, and avoiding the common mistakes that destroyed families who couldn't handle sudden fortune. Theodore studied what happened to lottery winners, inheritance recipients, and other people who acquired sudden wealth. Edmund explained. He identified the most common problems and developed strategies for avoiding them. Over the following hours, as Edmund walked the family through Theodore's comprehensive planning, they began to understand that they weren't facing these challenges alone. Theodore had anticipated every obstacle they would encounter and prepared solutions based on decades of research and observation. But even with Theodore's guidance, the practical realities of their situation were overwhelming. By evening, the mansion's phone was ringing constantly as word began to spread through their small community. Someone had noticed the unusual number of cars in the mansion's driveway. Someone else had seen Michael making phone calls to federal agencies. By dinner time, rumors were circulating that the elderly couple who'd bought the old mansion had made some kind of extraordinary discovery. The first reporter arrived at 7:30. A young woman from the regional newspaper who'd heard whispers about a significant archaeological find at the restored mansion. When Harold politely declined to comment, she began asking neighbors about unusual activity at the property. Within hours, the story had grown from an archaeological find to a treasure discovery to speculation about hidden millions. By morning, the mansion's driveway was crowded with news vans. Reporters shouted questions whenever Harold or Evelyn appeared. Helicopters circled overhead, filming the property for television news broadcasts. The quiet retirement adventure Harold and Evelyn had planned had become a media circus that threatened to consume their lives. "This is exactly what Theodore warned about," Edmund said as they watched the news coverage from the mansion's kitchen. "Media attention can destroy privacy, attract dangerous people, and make normal life impossible." Patricia, now functioning as the family's legal advisor, had spent the morning fielding calls from reporters, lawyers, and representatives of various organizations who claimed connections to the Ashford family or rights to the treasure. "We need to establish a media strategy immediately," she said. "And we need to get Mom and Dad somewhere safe until this dies down." But it wasn't dying down. By afternoon, the story had been picked up by national news networks. Elderly couple finds $200 million treasure in mansion attic was being broadcast across the country. Harold and Evelyn's photographs, taken from their social media accounts and high school yearbooks, were appearing on television screens and newspaper front pages. The attention brought complications none of them had anticipated. Distant relatives emerged from genealogical research, claiming they deserved shares of the treasure. Ashford family descendants, some legitimate and some fraudulent, filed legal claims asserting their rights to Theodore's estate. The state government began investigating whether the treasure should be considered abandoned property belonging to the public. Most disturbingly, the mansion began attracting dangerous attention. Security cameras Edmund had installed captured images of people attempting to scale the property's gates after dark. Cars with out-of-state license plates were seen circling the area, their occupants taking photographs and making notes. The local sheriff's department, overwhelmed by the sudden security concerns, requested assistance from state police. "We need to leave," David said bluntly during a family meeting 3 days after the media attention began. "This place isn't safe anymore. And staying here is putting everyone at risk." Harold looked around the mansion that had been their dream home for exactly 1 week. "Where would we go?" The estate management firm Theodore recommended maintains secure properties for exactly this situation, Edmund explained. "Private residences with professional security, where families can live normally while adjusting to sudden wealth. Running away feels wrong," Evelyn said quietly. "This is our home. We bought it, we love it, and we're not going to be driven out by reporters and treasure hunters." Patricia shook her head. "Mom, this isn't about pride, it's about safety. The treasure has made you targets for people who won't hesitate to use violence to get what they want." As if summoned by her words, they heard car doors slamming outside. Through the mansion's front windows, they could see several men in dark clothing approaching the house. These weren't reporters or curiosity seekers. They moved with the purposeful coordination of people who intended to take rather than ask. Edmund immediately activated the mansion's security system, which sent alerts to local police and the private security firm Theodore had contracted decades earlier. Within minutes, sirens were approaching from multiple directions. The men outside, apparently recognizing they'd lost the element of surprise, retreated to their vehicles and disappeared into the growing dusk. "That settles it," Michael said firmly. "You're leaving tonight." By midnight, Harold and Evelyn were sitting in the back of an armored sedan, watching Rosewood Manor disappear into the darkness behind them. Edmund sat beside them, carrying a briefcase containing the most important documents from Theodore's collection. The rest of the treasure was being secured by professional asset management specialists who would ensure its safety, while the family determined their next steps. "I feel like we're abandoning everything," Evelyn said sadly as they drove through the night toward a secure compound 200 miles away. "You're protecting everything," Edmund replied gently. "Theodore's legacy, your safety, and your ability to fulfill the responsibility you've accepted. This is temporary. Once the initial media attention dies down and proper security measures are in place, you'll be able to return home." Harold stared out the window at the dark countryside passing by. A week ago, he'd been a retired construction worker, looking forward to fixing up an old mansion with his wife. Tonight, he was one of the wealthiest men in America, fleeing his home to escape treasure hunters and media attention. "Do you think we made the right choice?" he asked Edmund quietly. Edmund considered the question seriously. Theodore faced similar challenges when he first inherited his family's wealth. He wrote that the early period of adjustment was the most difficult part of his entire life. But he also wrote that learning to handle extraordinary resources responsibly was the most meaningful accomplishment of his lifetime. "How long does the adjustment take?" Theodore wrote that it took him 3 years to feel comfortable with his wealth, and 5 years to feel truly confident in his philanthropic decisions. But he also noted that the timeline depends largely on having the right support systems and maintaining focus on the legacy's true purpose. As they drove through the night toward an uncertain future, Harold and Evelyn began to understand that accepting Theodore's treasure had been only the beginning of their real challenge. Learning to live with extraordinary wealth, managing its complications, and fulfilling the responsibility it represented would require wisdom, courage, and determination they weren't sure they possessed. But they also understood that they'd been chosen for this responsibility because Theodore believed they could handle it. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay the opportunity to prove him right, to demonstrate that ordinary people could manage extraordinary resources wisely, and to show their children and the world that character matters more than credentials when it comes to handling the greatest challenges life can present. The armored sedan carried them toward a secure compound where they would spend the next several months learning to be philanthropists, community leaders, and guardians of a legacy that could transform countless lives. Behind them, Rosewood Manor stood empty but protected, waiting for their return. And in safe deposit boxes and secure facilities across 3 states, Theodore's carefully assembled treasure waited to be transformed from hidden wealth into active service. Harold and Evelyn Martinez, the elderly couple who'd been mocked for buying an abandoned mansion, were about to discover what it truly meant to have the power to change the world. But first, they had to learn how to survive having that power without letting it change them beyond recognition. The real test of Theodore's faith in them was just beginning. The morning sun filtered through bulletproof glass as Harold and Evelyn sat in the dining room of Whitmore Estate, a secure compound nestled in the mountains 200 miles from their beloved Rosewood Manor. For 3 months, this had been their temporary home while they learned to navigate the complexities of extraordinary wealth. The estate's Georgian architecture and manicured gardens were beautiful, but they weren't home. Every morning, Evelyn would stand at the window and look toward the distant horizon, wondering when they'd be able to return to the mansion that had changed their lives. Harold spread Theodore's comprehensive philanthropic guidelines across the mahogany table, documents he'd studied so thoroughly he could recite them from memory. Beside them lay modern reports from the team of advisors Edmund had assembled: tax attorneys, security specialists, investment managers, and community development experts. After 90 days of intensive education, Harold and Evelyn were finally ready to begin implementing Theodore's vision. "The scholarship program should be our first initiative," Evelyn said, reviewing a proposal they'd developed with education consultants. Theodore's research showed that educational support creates the most lasting positive impact on communities. Harold nodded, examining financial projections that would have terrified him 6 months earlier, but now seemed manageable. 50 full scholarships per year for local students. Not just tuition, but living expenses, books, and mentoring support. Theodore's notes indicated that comprehensive assistance produces significantly better graduation rates than partial scholarships. They'd learned that effective philanthropy required the same careful planning and attention to detail that Harold had applied to construction projects throughout his career. Good intentions weren't enough. Success demanded research, measurement, and adaptive management based on real outcomes rather than hopeful assumptions. Edmund entered the dining room carrying a secure telephone and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "I have news from Rosewood Manor," he announced. "The security improvements are complete, and the media attention has finally subsided. You can go home whenever you're ready." Evelyn felt tears welling in her eyes. 3 months had felt like 3 years. She missed their morning coffee on the mansion's wraparound porch, missed the way afternoon sunlight streamed through the restored stained glass windows, missed the sense of possibility that had filled every room of their dream home. "What about the protesters?" Harold asked. A group calling themselves Citizens for Public Treasure had been demanding that the Ashford fortune be turned over to state authorities for public use. They'd maintained a vigil outside the mansion's gates for weeks, drawing media attention and complicating any return. "Gone," Edmund reported with satisfaction. "Once the courts confirmed the legal transfer of ownership and the IRS accepted your tax payments, they lost public support. Most people now understand that Theodore's plan was both legal and intentional. The legal challenges had been resolved more easily than anyone anticipated. Patricia's research had uncovered documentation proving that Theodore's estate planning had been reviewed and approved by federal authorities decades earlier. The treasure transfer was entirely legitimate, with all taxes properly calculated and paid. Even the most aggressive challenges from supposed Ashford relatives had been dismissed when genetic testing proved they had no biological connection to Theodore's family line. By afternoon, Harold and Evelyn were sitting in the back of their armored sedan once again, this time traveling toward home rather than away from it. The countryside looked different than it had during their nighttime flight 3 months earlier. Spring had arrived while they'd been in hiding, painting the landscape in shades of green that promised renewal and growth. As they crested the hill above Rosewood Manor, Evelyn gasped. The mansion looked exactly as they'd left it, but the surrounding property had been transformed. Professional landscapers had restored the formal gardens to their original elegance. The circular driveway was paved with new stone that complemented the mansion's architecture. Security improvements were subtle but comprehensive, sophisticated cameras disguised as decorative elements, motion sensors hidden among flowering bushes, and a guardhouse designed to look like a charming cottage near the front gate. "Welcome home," Edmund said softly as their car passed through gates that now bore a brass plaque reading Ashford Martinez Community Foundation. They'd decided during their months of planning to honor Theodore's legacy while making their ownership clear. The foundation structure would allow them to pursue philanthropic goals while maintaining legal control of both the treasure and their beloved mansion. But the most remarkable change wasn't visible from the driveway. Word of their return had spread through the community, and their neighbors had gathered to welcome them home. Cars lined the country road leading to the mansion. Families stood in clusters along the route, children holding handmade signs that read, "Welcome back and thank you." As their sedan passed, people waved and applauded, not as celebrity seekers greeting famous people, but as community members celebrating the return of neighbors they'd missed. Harold and Evelyn stepped out of their car to find themselves surrounded by genuine warmth rather than the invasive curiosity they'd feared. Mrs. Henderson, from the neighboring farm, approached with a covered casserole dish and a shy smile. "We thought you might be tired from traveling," she said simply. "This is just a little something to save you cooking tonight." Behind her, Mr. Peterson, from the hardware store, held a small potted plant. "Thought you might like to add this to your gardens," he said awkwardly. "It's a rosebush, seemed appropriate for Rosewood Manor." One by one, their neighbors approached with small gifts and quiet expressions of welcome. No one asked about the treasure or the media coverage or the legal complications. They simply welcomed Harold and Evelyn home as the people they'd always been, neighbors who'd chosen to invest in their community rather than flee to more comfortable circumstances. That evening, as they sat on their restored front porch, drinking coffee from their own cups and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Harold and Evelyn felt the peace they'd been missing for 3 months. They were home, they were safe, and they were ready to begin the real work of their lives. "Tomorrow we start implementing Theodore's vision," Harold said, reviewing the foundation's first-year plan. 50 scholarships, low-interest loans for local businesses, funding for the new community center, and emergency assistance for families facing medical or economic crises. Evelyn smiled, feeling energized rather than overwhelmed by the scope of their responsibilities. "And the best part is, we don't have to figure it out alone. Theodore left us everything we need to succeed." The next morning brought their first test of how much they'd learned during their 3 months of intensive education. Michael, Patricia, and David arrived together, this time not as concerned children rushing to protect their parents, but as adults who'd requested a formal meeting with the Foundation's board of directors. The family gathered in the mansion's restored library, where floor-to-ceiling shelves, lined with Theodore's rare books, created an atmosphere of dignity and scholarship. Harold and Evelyn sat behind the mahogany desk, where Theodore had once planned his philanthropic initiatives, while their children took seats in comfortable leather chairs that had been arranged in a semicircle before them. "Mom, Dad," Patricia began formally, "we owe you an apology. When you first told us about the treasure, we assumed you were being victimized or had lost your judgment. We were wrong, and we're sorry." Michael nodded seriously. "We spent the last 3 months researching everything you've been through, and we've come to understand that you've handled an impossible situation with remarkable wisdom and grace." David, who'd always been the most skeptical of the 3 children, spoke with obvious respect in his voice. "We've seen the Foundation's plans, reviewed the legal structures you've established, and studied the philanthropic strategies you've developed. This isn't the work of confused elderly people who stumbled into good fortune. This is the work of visionary leaders who've accepted enormous responsibility and prepared themselves to handle it effectively." Harold felt pride swelling in his chest, not because his children finally approved of his decisions, but because they'd taken the time to truly understand what he and Evelyn had accomplished. The treasure hadn't made them rich, it had made them stewards of something far more valuable than money. "We've been hoping you'd be willing to work with the Foundation," Evelyn said carefully. "Not as our children helping their aging parents, but as professionals who share our commitment to Theodore's vision." What followed was the most meaningful conversation the family had shared in years. Patricia offered to provide legal counsel for the Foundation, specializing in the complex regulations governing philanthropic organizations. Michael proposed managing the Foundation's financial operations using his accounting expertise to ensure every dollar was tracked and optimized for maximum community impact. David suggested developing technology systems that would help the Foundation operate efficiently while maintaining the personal touch that made their approach effective. "We want to move our families back here," Patricia said, speaking for all 3 siblings. "We want our children to grow up in a community where they can see what's possible when people dedicate themselves to helping others. We want to be part of what you're building." That afternoon, Harold and Evelyn drove through their community with new eyes, seeing not just the problems that needed solving, but the potential that could be unleashed with proper resources and support. The elementary school that needed updated technology and smaller class sizes, the main street where half the storefronts stood empty, waiting for entrepreneurs who needed startup capital. The senior center that operated out of a cramped building when it should have a spacious facility that could serve as a hub for community activities. They stopped at the local diner, where they'd eaten countless meals during the early weeks of mansion restoration. The owner, a hard-working woman named Sarah, who'd raised 3 children while managing the business alone, greeted them with the same warm smile she'd always offered. "Heard you folks have been dealing with some excitement lately," Sarah said tactfully as she poured their coffee. "Hope things are settling down for you." Harold and Evelyn exchanged glances, then Harold reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a foundation business card. "Sarah, we'd like to talk with you about a small business expansion loan program we're starting. No interest, flexible repayment terms, designed to help local businesses grow and create jobs." Sarah stared at the card for a long moment, then looked up with tears in her eyes. "I've been dreaming of expanding into the empty space next door, adding a bakery, and maybe hiring a few more people. But banks won't lend to small businesses like mine without collateral I don't have." "Theodore Ashford understood that problem," Evelyn said gently. "That's why he designed a lending program specifically for local entrepreneurs who've proven they can run successful businesses but need capital to grow." Word of the foundation's first initiative spread the community faster than Harold and Evelyn had anticipated. Within a week, their newly installed phone system was ringing constantly with inquiries from families seeking scholarship assistance, small business owners interested in expansion loans, and community leaders proposing projects that aligned with the foundation's mission. But perhaps the most gratifying response came from their grandchildren. Patricia's 2 teenagers and David's elementary-age twins had initially been skeptical about moving to what they considered a boring small town. However, once they understood the scope of their grandparents' philanthropic work, they became enthusiastic supporters and valuable contributors. Patricia's daughter Emma, a high school junior with interests in environmental science, proposed establishing community gardens that would provide fresh produce for low-income families while teaching sustainable agriculture practices. David's son Marcus, a computer-savvy 10-year-old, suggested creating a technology training center where seniors could learn digital skills from young volunteers. "They're not just proud of what you've accomplished," Patricia told her parents during a family dinner in the mansion's restored dining room. "They're inspired by it. They're starting to understand that wealth isn't about what you can buy for yourself, it's about what you can make possible for others." The foundation's first year exceeded everyone's expectations. 50 students received comprehensive scholarship support, with 48 successfully completing their first year of PLAS, college with grades that qualified them for continued assistance. 12 local businesses received expansion loans, creating 37 new jobs and increasing local tax revenue by enough to fund improvements to the community's infrastructure. The new community center opened 6 months ahead of schedule and immediately became the hub for activities ranging from senior fitness classes to youth job training programs. But the foundation's most significant impact couldn't be measured in dollars or statistics. Harold and Evelyn had demonstrated something their community hadn't believed was possible, that ordinary people, given extraordinary resources, could create lasting positive change through careful planning, hard work, and genuine commitment to helping others. The transformation was visible everywhere. Main Street no longer had empty storefronts. They'd been filled by local entrepreneurs whose businesses were thriving with foundation support. The elementary school had upgraded technology, reduced class sizes, and established partnerships with the community college that allowed advanced students to begin earning college credit. The senior center had moved into a beautiful new facility that also housed job training programs, community meeting spaces, and a health clinic staffed by nurse practitioners who provided basic medical care for families who couldn't afford traditional health care. Most importantly, the community had developed a culture of mutual support and shared responsibility. People helped neighbors not because they were required to, but because they'd seen what became possible when everyone worked together toward common goals. On the 2nd anniversary of their treasure discovery, Harold and Evelyn stood once again in the secret attic room where their adventure had begun. The safe now contained not treasure, but records of the foundation's accomplishments. photographs of scholarship recipients at their college graduations, financial reports showing the success of businesses they'd helped establish, and letters from families whose lives had been transformed by the Foundation's assistance. Theodore would be proud, Edmund said, joining them in the candlelit room where everything had started. His vision was that ordinary people with extraordinary resources could accomplish remarkable things. You've proved him right. Harold picked up Theodore's original journal, which they'd preserved as a reminder of the wisdom that guided their work. We learned something Theodore knew, but we had to discover for ourselves, that the real treasure isn't what you find, it's what you do with the courage to change, not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. Evelyn nodded, thinking about the journey that had brought them from a crumbling mansion purchase that everyone called foolish to leadership roles in community transformation that everyone called inspiring. The money was just the tool. The real treasure was learning that we had the wisdom and strength to use it well. Their children had indeed moved back to the community, bringing their families and their professional skills to support the Foundation's continued growth. Patricia had established a legal clinic that provided affordable legal services for working families. Michael had created financial literacy programs that helped people manage money and build wealth responsibly. David had developed technological systems that other communities were adopting to improve their own philanthropic efforts. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Harold and Evelyn themselves. The uncertain retirees who'd bought an abandoned mansion because they couldn't afford anything better had become confident leaders who'd learned to manage resources that could transform entire communities. The people their children had once considered irresponsible had become role models whose decisions were studied by philanthropic organizations across the country. As they walked through their mansion on that anniversary evening, they passed photographs documenting 2 years of community transformation. Scholarship recipients at graduation ceremonies, business owners cutting ribbons at grand openings, families moving into new affordable housing, children playing in parks that hadn't existed before the Foundation's work began. You know what I realized? Harold said as they settled into their favorite chairs on the front porch, watching another sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. We didn't find Theodore's treasure by accident. Theodore's treasure found us. Evelyn smiled, understanding exactly what her husband meant, the timing, the circumstances, the legal complications that had been resolved so smoothly. Even their children's initial opposition that had tested their resolve, everything had unfolded in a way that seemed almost intentional, as if Theodore Ashford had reached across decades to ensure his legacy would find exactly the right guardians. And now? She asked. Harold looked out over the community they'd helped transform, at the lights beginning to twinkle in homes where families were thriving because of opportunities the Foundation had provided. Now we keep building. Theodore's plan was designed to last for generations, and we're just getting started. As if summoned by their conversation, a young woman walked up the mansion's front path. She was one of their first scholarship recipients, now graduated from college, with a degree in education and returning to teach at the elementary school where she'd once been a student. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, she said shyly as she approached the porch. I wanted to thank you again for making my education possible. But more than that, I wanted you to know that I'm starting a scholarship fund of my own. It's small now, just enough to help one student per year, but I want to continue what you've started. Harold and Evelyn exchanged glances, both of them feeling the profound satisfaction that comes from seeing dreams become reality. Theodore's vision hadn't just created one generation of philanthropy, it had inspired a culture of giving that would continue long after they were gone. That's the most wonderful news we could hear, Evelyn said warmly. Theodore always believed that the greatest success would come when people who'd been helped became helpers themselves. As the young teacher walked away toward a life of service, inspired by the Foundation's example, Harold and Evelyn sat quietly in the gathering dusk. They'd learned something that couldn't be taught in schools or measured in bank accounts, that the greatest treasures aren't the ones we keep for ourselves, but the ones we share with others. 3 years earlier, their children had laughed at the idea of elderly parents buying an abandoned mansion with their life savings. Tonight, those same children were working alongside their parents to implement philanthropic programs that were being studied and replicated by communities across the nation. Harold and Evelyn Martinez had discovered something more valuable than Theodore Ashford's carefully preserved fortune. They'd discovered their own capacity for wisdom, leadership, and transformative generosity. They'd learned that ordinary people, given extraordinary opportunities, could indeed accomplish remarkable things. And as another peaceful evening settled over Rosewood Manor, they understood that their real adventure wasn't ending, it was just beginning. Theodore's legacy would continue through their work, through their children's contributions, through the students they'd educated, and the businesses they'd supported, and the community they'd transformed. Because the greatest treasures aren't the ones we find buried in forgotten places. The greatest treasures are the ones we create through the courage to believe in ourselves and the wisdom to invest in others. And those treasures, unlike gold or cash or precious stones, grow more valuable every time they're shared. Anyone can change the world if they're stubborn enough to stand their ground and brave enough to trust in the power of community, compassion, and commitment to something greater than themselves. As the morning sun warmed the stone walls of Rosewood Manor, Harold and Evelyn Martinez didn't reach for their old to-do lists of repair projects and restoration tasks. Instead, they reached for their foundation's annual report, not to count their wealth, but to measure their impact on the lives of everyone around them. The elderly couple whose children once called them foolish had become the leaders who proved that the greatest discoveries aren't the treasures we stumble upon, but the courage we find to use those treasures wisely. Because for Harold and Evelyn, and for everyone whose lives they've touched, the real legacy isn't what they inherited from Theodore Ashford, it's what they're building for the generations who will follow them, one dream, one family, one community at a time. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of hope, discovery, and second chances. Click to continue your journey with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the greatest treasures are the ones we choose to share.